Hello everybody and welcome back to the free online woodworking school where we aim to take your woodworking skills to the next level. In today's video, we're going to get the top and the bottom profiled and attached. Let's get going. Right, so I've already gone ahead and got these sized as per my instructions earlier on in the series. Exactly the same process as it was when we were edge jointing and sizing the side panels of the cabinet. Remember your face sides and face edges and all those other things, and you'll end up with some nice square panels like this. If you followed the cutting list for this project, these will be made out of two separate components that are edge jointed together. But for me, I was able to find one wide bit that was able to do the entire cabinet in one. So it's up to you. If you want to do it all in one like this and save some time, go ahead. But if you want some more edge jointing practice, do it in two separate components. But before even thinking about attaching the top and bottom, we've got a little bit of flushing off to do. Now, unfortunately, I've ended up with a tiny bit of endgrain proud on these sides, which isn't something that I was aiming for, but here we are. I can show you how to flush that off. So there's a couple of ways you can go about clamping this cabinet. You could either get a piece of wood, clamp to your bench, and then hook the cabinet over it like that, and then plane into the bench, which is a really nice way of doing it. Or you can just clamp the cabinet directly to the side of the workbench if you have a face that's flush on it, and that will again give you really nice support on this end grain. Because effective support is really what you need when you're trying to flush off long components like this. If you just get a block plane and try and scrub away at it, you're not going to get a lot of control. The cabinet's going to be sliding and vibrating all over the place, and it's not going to be very easy. So using either of those methods should work very well for you. So because this is end grain, what we want to avoid is just planing all the way along off the back edge, because those fibers that are going up are just going to break away. So instead, we're going to work from the outside to the middle, and then from there to the middle as well. And then if that leaves us with some sort of bump in the middle, we'll just do some short skims to level it out. So I'm using a low angle plane for this because it tends to work a little bit better on end grain, but a standard angle plane should work well as well. As long as it's sharp, a standard angle plane will work as well. And candle wax should make this a little less annoying. There we go. And when I'm flushing this off, I'm actually angling the plane in doing so. And the reason for this is, there's two reasons for it. The first one is that skewing the plane effectively lowers the angle of the cutting edge. This is not something I'm going to explain in this video, but if you watch my video on how to plane correctly, it's all covered in that video. The second reason is that when you plane, you are going to start hitting the edge of this component running perpendicular to the one that I'm working on. In doing so, if I was going in straight like this, there's a high chance that I'm going to blow out this inside corner of it and cause some disgusting splintering. Obviously that bit's going to be hidden, so if it happens to a small extent, then you're quite unlikely to see it. But by skewing the plane, when it goes through, it's going to shear off that edge rather than just punch it off. So you're much less likely to break it off if your plane is well set up and sharp, of course. So we'll do a quick check to see if everything's sitting level, which that is. So I'm happy with that. And then I'll also do a check along the length. Yeah, there's a tiny dip, but by the time we add the screws, those will pull these components up and get the flat against the underside of the top. Okay, so this one's got a bit more of a bow in it. You can probably see that bit of light sort of peeking through underneath the plane. So we've got a high point here, so I need to take down the end grain a bit more. And then there's actually a high point on the dovetail component itself, sort of around here. So it seems that I've planed this a little bit too low, and as a result, that is now the high spot. So that's the importance of this. Just keep checking as you go to ensure you don't overdo it on any of the components. Right, there we go. So the cabinet is now flushed off, and I will just reiterate, that is no easy job. You need to have a well set up plane, you need to have a sharp plane, and plenty of candle wax really helps with it as well. Just scribble it on the bottom of the plane every couple of minutes or so, and seriously, it makes gliding over end grain a lot easier. And also, just remember, after every pass, keep checking your work. So we've now got the front of the cabinet to flush off, meaning that we're probably going to be wanting to clamp this flat to the table. Keep in mind, however, we've only got some very thin 4mm sections for the cabinet to rest on, so just clamping it down straight to a bench is possibly going to damage those. So I'm actually going to use the top and bottom of the cabinet that I sized earlier to elevate this off the workbench below and take the pressure off the leftover material from that rebate. Clamping this is going to be a bit iffy, but it's certainly worth the effort. So we'll start by getting this shelf down flush with the front of the cabinet. Just remember, we intentionally left this proud so we had a bit to plane down afterwards. Again, just watch it as you come onto the edge and also off the back here, because you don't want to catch that side grain and cause it to break off. Similarly, on the inside face here, you don't want to cause that to break off either. So just skewing the plane lowers the risk of that happening. Okay, long edges now. I'm not doing this in any particular order at the moment. I'm just finding the areas that are high, and once they're flush, we'll check it after that. All right, and then we're just going to give it a very light sand on the bottom here to get rid of any small lumps and bumps in places. You don't want to be removing ridges and things with sandpaper because it will just follow those contours, but any small areas of misalignment or areas where you've got tracks with the plane, then you can remove those with the sandpaper if you want. The important thing here, use a hard block to wrap it round as opposed to a soft one that's going to start pillowing over those edges. And I'm starting with 120 grit here, being very careful not to round over the edges. And down here where the stretchers meet the top and bottom, I'm trying to create a hard 90-degree edge on these corners so that there is no shadow gap or frilliness, I suppose, along that edge. But I can just see there's a few lumps and bumps on there from where it's obviously been knocking around a bit. And sandpaper wrapped around a hard block pulled really taut around those corners so that it's not going to be rounding anything over. Works really well for this. But I'm being very deliberate with my strokes. Some on there, some on the top. Yeah, that's looking better already. So all the preparation that needed to be done before attaching the top and bottom has been complete. And now I want to do a bit of drilling and screwing theory with you. So in order to attach the bottom to the cabinet, we are going to be using screws, obviously. So we covered this briefly in the dovetail box project when we were attaching the plywood base to the bottom of the box. But because we're screwing through a thicker component here, as opposed to a 4mm bit of ply, it's especially important on this. So we are going to have to widen these holes in here to a clearance hole, which I'll explain again later on. Now you might be wondering why we didn't drill these to a clearance hole before even assembling it. And the reason for this is because this is going to have to be probably a 4 or 5mm clearance hole. And what I didn't want to do was to tell you to drill it to a 4mm hole and then find out that you can't actually fit your 4mm drill bit in there in order to mark through it onto the bottom plinth. Whereas if you've only drilled that to a pilot hole, you should be able to just get a small drill bit in there and mark it onto the plinth like that, and then you'll have your 4 screw locations. So we'll start with the top because that's the easy one, and I've already picked my face side and face edge. I've gone for thinner grain at the front of the cabinet, tapering to wider grain at the back. It's usually what I go for when orienting grain. And obviously the cabinet's laying on its back, so we can be sure that this is flush there. And firstly, we just need to get it central so that we've got an even overhang either side, and then carefully clamp that down. And then in here, just going to get that drill bit and give it a little twist in each of the 4 locations. I could do this with a drill, but it's not going to quite fit in there and go down perpendicular. So doing it this way means that I can remove the top and finish off the holes later. And there you go. There is our 4 holes, or 4 markings. So moving on to this bottom component now, because it's made out of one piece of timber, it's highly likely that that's going to bow over time, and it has already started doing so. If I put this on here, you can see that it's slightly cupping away from the cabinet. Put it on that way, and there is a hollow in the center. Now, because we're going to be screwing this on both the front and back of the cabinet, if I do it this way round, then that hollow in the middle is never going to be pulled out. Whereas if I flip it around this way, once it's screwed in at the back, it should pull it in nice and tight along the entire depth of the cabinet. So for that reason, I'm going to go with the cup facing this way round. So we'll get these pilot holes done now. I'll aim to go maybe about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, and I'm just going to wrap a little bit of electrical tape around the drill bit to act as a depth stop. Doesn't have to be electrical tape, I just find it sticks a little bit better. Right, so with the pilot holes sorted, we can now safely widen the clearance holes. And when widening pre-existing holes, drill bit selection is very, very important. And on the whole, you've got two different types. We've got one here, which is a standard twist drill. This has got a cone point on it, and these can be used to drill wood, plastic, depending on the material. They could also drill metal, and they're pretty much a general purpose drill bit and most commonly found. This one, however, is called a lip and spur bit, or otherwise known as a brad point drill bit. And this has a little point on the end known as the spur, and it's got two lips on it either side, which score the circumference of the cut before removing the material in the middle, meaning you get a really clean cut from using these drill bits. However, they're mainly used for wood. Now, the advantage to this drill bit is that spur on the end of it, because it allows it to precisely locate into some timber and allows you to easily get a precise starting location. A cone pointed drill bit, however, doesn't dig in as well and is more likely to chatter over the surface before engaging in the cut, so it's harder to get precise location from these. However, the advantage to these drill bits when widening pre-existing holes is that cone point on them, because it self-centers in the hole that's already existing. Whereas the lip and spur bit, because it relies on that spur to precisely get its starting location, it can't actually engage in any material, so there is no guarantee that you're going to get it central in that hole. Not to mention the fact that when the lips engage either side, it's going to jump all over the place because they rely on that central point keeping it locked down. So if we go for the standard cone point to start with, self-centered, and there we go. There was a little bit of grabbing and stuff, and I had to be careful not to overdo it, but looking down into that hole, I can see that this is centered really nicely over the hole below. Whereas if we swap this round to the lip and spur and try and drill the other one, it's blimmin' horrible. So when it comes to widening these holes, make sure you're using a standard twist drill. In terms of the diameter, that depends on the size of screw you intend to use. So when attaching the top and bottom of the cabinet to the carcass, I am going to be using a 4 by 25mm screw. 4 refers to the width of the screw threads and 25 refers to the overall length of it. And so obviously I've chosen 25 so it doesn't blow through the top or bottom of the cabinet once I screw it in. And in terms of the width, that generally dictates how coarse the thread is going to be. If you go for a wider one, such as 5 or a 6mm, then it's going to be a much wider, coarser thread. Whereas if you go for a 3 or a 3.5, then it's going to be a finer thread. And personally, when I'm putting screws into things, I try and go for as wide and coarse of a thread as possible so that it gets as much bite into the material. So in this case, that's why I'm going for a 4mm screw. So if I draw that a little bit bigger, so there is our 4mm distance, and this area here is the 25. I've written that upside down. There you go. So when screwing wood together, let's say this is the item that we want to screw down and this is the thing that we want to screw that item to. So the screw will be coming through from this way. What we've done so far is we've drilled a pilot hole going through the first component, and then in this video I've drilled it about 2/3 to 3/4 into the material behind. Now we've likely all experienced it before when you drive in a screw and then that material starts separating at the join line here, and you never really get a good finish between the two, and you have to kind of take the screw out and re-drive it a few times, and it becomes a bit of a pain, not to mention when we're going to be trying to do this within that drawer cavity later. So what we do, instead of just simply doing a pilot hole through both the components, we widen this one to a clearance hole. So the pilot hole we've done to about 2mm so far, which I find works for a 4mm wide screw. This clearance hole is drilled to 4mm, which is going to match the thread on the screw. So that diameter of the widest part of the thread will match the widest part of the hole. That means that this screw is just going to slide into that clearance hole without engaging in any of the material. It's just going to be able to move up and down in there. Now this may seem counterintuitive, but if you think about it, what happens is once that screw drops through this clearance hole and engages in the pilot hole below, that's where it starts screwing down. And you've got the countersink on the top of the screw here, which is going to then engage in the top of this material, and that is going to be what pulls this down into the component below. And in doing this method, you don't get any separation of the material, it's just drive it in once and it's ready to go. The difficulty with this lies when you drill a clearance hole before drilling the pilot hole below, which is what Rob faced in the student series with the dovetail box when he was attaching the base of the box. So just to clarify that, he drilled this 4mm clearance hole before drilling the pilot below. That meant that when the pilot went into that clearance hole, there was no way of guaranteeing that he was getting it central in there. So that is actually where you could use a brad point drill bit. You can slide that into the hole and then the spur on the end is going to be perfectly central within that clearance hole and give you a little mark. Then you just simply take this component off and drill the pilot hole as normal. Then all you do is just countersink this area and you are left with exactly the same thing as we did on this one. It's just you've gone about it a different way. So on these bottom ones, the only option is to go through from the base into the cavity, which isn't ideal. Normally you would do it from the countersunk side outwards, but we haven't got a choice in this case. So very carefully, cone pointed drill bit or a twist drill. And that's going to centralise itself on the pilot hole. As for these ones, I should be able to get the drill in close enough to the side to ensure it's going upright. There we go. So now that screw does not engage in there at all, but it's a really tight fit sideways. So that is a perfectly sized clearance hole. And the other nice thing about clearance holes is that you can slide all the screws into position and then you can get those located on the holes below rather than just try and line it up blindly. Now I'm not going to do them too tight in this case because I still need to cut the profile on it later, but I just want to test the fit of everything. Okay, and as for getting inside this drawer cavity to drive in these screws, obviously it's going to be a little bit difficult. A few methods of doing it. You can get right angle attachments for drills, which should be able to fit in there and then drive those screws in, or simply get a 1/4 inch drive socket and put a 1/4 inch or 6.5mm socket into it. That will then accept your standard bits like that. Granted, it's not usually magnetic, but it's pretty easy to find a socket like that, and they're very useful for getting into small cavities such as this without having to buy any fancy right angle adapters and stuff like that. Right, so now to put the profile on the top and bottom, but don't feel inclined to do this. If you like that square edge look, leave it. There's no rules on this whatsoever. Now, because I primarily want this to be a hand tool based project, I'm just going to be putting a simple chamfer around the top of this, and I'm going to be doing that with some hand planes, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. But if you have a router table and you have a few different profile cutters, then you know, have a go with that. You can do a chamfer, you can do a rounded one, you can do whatever you want really. So while I've got it together like this, I'm just going to quickly mark the corners that I'm going to be chamfering. I might as well, saves on any potential screw ups later. And I'm literally just putting a line on the corner that's going to disappear. I'm not even marking the chamfer out properly at this point. Right, so when sizing these chamfers, I want to be left with a 5mm flat spot on the edge of these components. So because they're 15mm thick, I've set this to 10mm and we're going to scribe that in from both the sides and the front of the cabinet. We're not going to be doing any profile on the back. I would just like to stress that stays nice and square. And remember not to do these too deep because they can be challenging to remove with a plane afterwards. So don't go too mental with it. And after doing it on the faces, we're then going to be referencing the marking gauge on the face with the pen mark and scribing it down the sides. And then we're going to get these components in the vise to plane these profiles. Now, the order in which you plane these chamfers is quite important. If we go ahead and start planing this one and we get that down to the profile, when it comes to doing these ones on the end grain, if we plane along there and we get a bit of breakout on the front edge, then, you know, that's it. That material is gone unless you try and glue it back down, but we don't want to be doing that. So the best order to do this is actually start with these end pieces. Obviously we want to try and avoid breakout anyway, but if it does happen on this and we do end up getting a bit of breakout on that front edge, it won't matter because you'll then remove it when you do the long grain pass. So when doing these end ones, as I said, I want to try and avoid breakout anyway. So I'm going to go from the outsides and sort of stop 3/4 of the way through and then do the same from this side. Start from there and then finish here. And then for the final few passes, I'll go all the way along right off the back edge, making sure to get even pressure. But for now, we're just focusing on roughing out the chamfer. So essentially your goal at this point is to simply get it about 1 millimetre away from both of those lines. Once you've done that, that's where we'll start going to those long strokes in order to finish it off, but just roughing for now. And because I'm stopping about here, this is the profile that I've been left with. So we've got a massive chamfer here tapering off to pretty much nothing. So let's flip it round and start from the other side. Okay, so I've roughed the chamfer out and there is still about 1 millimetre of material to get back to before hitting the line along the top and along the bottom. And like by rough it out, I mean like this is actually still bumpy to some extent. I could probably put the plane on there and it's able to rock. In order to get back to 1 millimetre consistently along it, I've literally just been taking small strokes in certain areas. And the process we're about to do now will smooth all of those out while also getting down to that line. So we're taking a much finer shaving, and depending on the level of breakout you get on this, you can also clamp a piece of sacrificial material to the front in order to support that grain and prevent it splitting away. I don't think this is going to be too much of an issue. We'll see. And in fact, that still feels a little bit bitey, so a bit of candle wax on the bottom. It is unbelievable how much control you get from putting this on there. I really recommend it. And you'll also notice that I'm not holding the plane by the handle because that makes the center of gravity higher and makes it harder to balance on that small chamfer. Literally just push the plane down with your thumb along either the front here or in here, whatever, and you'll find it much easier to plant it on that chamfer. Look at that. Imagine if we'd already planed that first chamfer. Woo-hoo. But other than the monstrous breakout, look how that's turned out. It's lovely. Just needs a few strokes of a bit of sandpaper and that is ready to go. And there you go. That is how you, blimey, what have we done in this video? Flushed off the cabinet, profiled the top and bottom, and also attached them using clearance and pilot holes and all those fun other tasks. So as always guys, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to press the like button and subscribe by pressing the big round button to the left hand side of this video. You can move on to the next video by clicking on the link below. I'll see you then.